So, what I gotta say here is enough with the apocalyptic doomerism, alright? That's the topic of this one. So, alright. Every generation thinks it's living in the end times. Every generation believes this is the final unraveling. This is the great collapse. This is the moment history itself has finally reached its breaking point. And to be clear, there are real crises. There are real systems in decay. There are real dangers, real wars, real ecological stress, real institutional failures, real reasons to grieve, real reasons to be alarmed. But there's a fundamental. Excuse me. But there's a profound difference between responding to crisis and becoming possessed by crisis. Because what we're seeing right now is not just concern, it's not just realism, it's not even just pessimism, it's something deeper. It is collective existential panic masquerading as discernment. And even more than that, it is increasingly being shaped by overlapping systems that weaponize apocalyptic consciousness. Religious systems, political systems, technocratic systems, media systems, geopolitical mythologies. This matters because apocalyptic doomerism is no longer just a mood. It is becoming a globalized infrastructure of fear, a way of ongoing emotion, a way of organizing emotion, a way of organizing identity, a way of organizing consent, a way of organizing power. And if we want to understand why the culture of fear has spread so far beyond the United States, why it now feels ambient, planetary, almost atmospheric, we need to stop treating it like it's just some random hysteria, because it isn't. It has been engineered, monetized, mythologized, ritualized, and exported. So in this video, I want to talk about apocalyptic doomerism not as just a personal or spiritual problem, but as a systems problem. A convergence of collective existentialist dysregulation, algorithmic amplification, Christian nationalism, TESCREAL-style technocratic eschatology, and forms of apocalyptic geopolitics, especially where Christian Zionism and state power converge. Because panic is not prophecy, and doomerism is not discernment. One of the biggest mistakes people make when talking about apocalyptic culture is assuming it's just a spontaneous emotional reaction, as if millions of people simply woke up one day and independently decided to become obsessed with collapse. That is not how this works. Yes, there is genuine fear. Yes, there is genuine uncertainty. Yes, there are real crises that destabilize people. But fear does not spread in a vacuum. Fear spreads through institutions, media ecosystems, ideological frameworks, political mythologies, charismatic authority structures, social incentives, repeated symbolic reinforcement. In other words, people do not just feel apocalypse, they're trained into apocalyptic interpretation. That is a very important distinction, because once you understand that, the conversation changes. This stops being, why are people being so dramatic? Why can't everyone calm down? Why is everyone being so negative? Or in other words, what I would, say as red flag, toxic, positive, key phrases. Yeah, if somebody's saying, just why can't everyone calm down, I'm going to instantly recognize that this person's either a little naive or toxically positive or both. So this stops becoming, those basic questions, and it becomes the deeper questions. It becomes, who benefits from keeping people in a state of dread? Which ideologies convert fear into authority? What media systems turn collapse into engagement? Which institutions need permanent emergency to sustain legitimacy? Which narratives make people easier to recruit, easier to govern, easier to manipulate? That is a far more serious question. And that is the question we need to ask. Because the culture of fear did not simply emerge. It has been built. So on to the collective existentialism without existential maturity. So here, but now before we get into the ideological systems, we need the psychological layer, because the systems only work this well if they find people who are already vulnerable to them. And one of the deepest vulnerabilities in modern life is what I would call collective existentialism without existential maturity. A lot of adults have never truly integrated mortality, impermanence, uncertainty, contingency, ambiguity, civilizational fragility, the fact that life can be meaningful without guarantees, the fact that history can be unstable without being metaphysically final. So when real instability appears, they don't have an integrated framework. They don't have existential courage. They have panic, projection, binary thinking, or psychological splitting, prophetic overreach, collapse identification, grand narrative addiction. And if you've never learned how to live in uncertainty, then uncertainty becomes intolerable. And when uncertainty becomes intolerable, people begin craving total explanations, total enemies, total certainty, total endings. Again, the pathological binary thinking, the pathological dualism, the psychological splitting that we are finding everywhere in our modern society. So this is why apocalyptic narratives are so psychologically seductive, because they transform uncertainty into inevitability. They may be terrifying, but terrifying certainty still feels safer than open ambiguity. So yes, some of what we are seeing is adults panicking together, but that's not the whole story. Because what matters next is which systems are actively taking that existential vulnerability and converting it into organized forms of fear, identity, and power. That is where the real diagnosis begins. The internet industrialized apocalypse. The internet did not invent end times thinking, but it absolutely industrialized it. It turned the end is near into a content genre, an engagement strategy, a monetization model, a subcultural identity, a ritualized emotional loop. And this matters because fear performs extremely well online. Fear gives you clicks, watch time, comments, shares, tribal bonding, urgency, repeated checking, heightened suggestibility. Nuance does not scale as easy as panic. Here is the layered historical analysis. Here is a historical... Man, I'm having crazy problems with, reading words in different directions, man. I'm like, I haven't gotten multilingual yet with all the, polyglotty, but apparently I'm still inhabiting that mind space because I'm like, apparently I'm reading English like it's freaking biblical Hebrew or something, and mixing biblical Hebrew with English together and just going back. It's a mess. So, but back to... Sorry about that. Anyway... So here is a layered historical analysis. It's harder to monetize then. It's over. This is the final stage. Only we can see what's happening. Everything you fear is being confirmed. That is algorithmic gold. And the more people being exposed to this content, the more fear becomes not just an emotion, but a shared atmosphere. That's when you get collapsed communities, doom identity, fear-based parasocial bonding, pseudo-prophetic influencers, crisis ritualization, audience capture around despair. This is where your earlier digital cargo or occult framework fits beautifully, because many people are not actually doing deep analysis. They are imitating the aesthetics of depth. They learn the cadence of urgency, the symbolism of revelation, the posture of forbidden knowledge, the vibe of seeing what others don't, without actually developing historical literacy, systems literacy, symbolic literacy, emotional regulation, or ethical responsibility. So yes, the internet has not just spread fear, it has taught people how to perform apocalyptic seriousness, and that performance has become culturally contagious. Christian nationalism, apocalypse as political theology. Now here we get more specific. One of the most powerful engines of weaponized eschatology. Oh my goodness, that AC blowing some dust in my nose. Oof. Oh my goodness. Anyway. Okay, so now we get more specific. One of the most powerful engines of weaponized eschatology in the United States, and one that had enormous global consequences, is Christian nationalism. And I want to be precise here. This is not a critique of Christians as a whole. This is not a critique of Christianity in general. This is not a claim that all religious seriousness is apocalyptic or authoritarian. This is a critique of a specific political theology. A fusion of religious identity, state power, civilizational nostalgia, moral panic, persecution mythology, imperial entitlement, and often end-time symbolism. Christian nationalized thrives on the idea that the nation has fallen from sacred order, pluralism is corruption, social change is degeneration, difference is threat, Crisis is divine sign. Restoration requires domination. And political struggle can be narrated as cosmic warfare. That is why it is so effective. It does not merely say things are changing. We have concerns. Our values are being challenged. It says we are under a civilizational siege. The nation is being spiritually destroyed. This decay proves we are in a final struggle. Only restoration through power can save what is sacred. That is apocalyptic energy. And apocalyptic energy is politically useful because it makes compromise feel like betrayal, pluralism feel like surrender, complexity feel like weakness, and authoritarian solutions feel morally necessary. And this is one of the core dynamics of weaponized eschatology. Crisis is not merely feared. It is narratively organized into sacred validation. A line that you should absolutely use. Christian nationalism does not merely fear collapse. It often narrates collapse as proof that domination is justified. Man, I do not hear it. I'm using merely all the time, so I'm getting, shocked when I'm seeing AI use it, man. Yeah, Christian nationalism does not merely fear collapse. It often narrates collapse as proof that dominion is justified. Yep, there's the feedback loop. You gotta learn the feedback loops when it comes to language, people. When you learn the feedback loops when it comes to language, you learn about your own psychological health and energy balance, energy curation. You learn about how other people are sending energies out there out of bad faith in institutionalized manner. This is not a conspiracy. This is actual reality, There are bad faith actors out in this planet, and they will weaponize your naivety, your emotional dysregulation against you. Don't let them do that, people. Let's get healthy. Let's help heal each other. Let's do this. So, this is the key because American media, military, finance, tech, and culture all have global reach. This doesn't stay domestic. It gets exported. And the emotional architecture of Christian nationalist panic becomes part of the global symbolic environment. Section 5, TESCREAL, secular eschatology and technocratic clothing. Now here's where a lot of people get confused. They assume apocalyptic thinking is mostly a religious problem. It is not. There is also a profoundly influential secularized eschatology operating through elite technocratic culture. And one of the most useful umbrellas people have been used to describe parts of that cluster is TESCREAL. TESCREAL is a contested term, and different people define it slightly differently. But broadly, it points to overlapping ideological tendencies around things like transhumanism, extropianism, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, singularitarianism, cosmism, certain hyper-abstract forms of rationalism, effective altruism in its more extreme elite forms, accelerationism, long-termism. Now, not every person associated with one of those labels is identical. That is important. And there is a reoccurring pattern worth naming. And that pattern is this. The present becomes morally downgraded in service of an abstract future. Oh, I'm seeing this everywhere, man. I'm even seeing this with freaking like the antinatalist. I used to be one, and I'm seeing the antinatalist, the present being morally downgraded. Let's not focus on all these, children going through all this trauma, in this hell reality, and let's not create, heaven on earth. Instead, let's just focus on, let's not have kids, and that'll solve everything, because we're morally degrading our lives for a potential idealistic abstract future. This is where this eschatology and the morals and ethics and all the systems and the transdualism, oh my god, it's crazy. So this is where the eschatology parallel becomes very clear. Instead of divine kingdom, final judgment, end times prophecy, instead you get the singularity, species transition, existential risk theater, civilizational bottlenecks, optimization at scale, speculative future populations, moral arithmetic so abstract that living people disappear. It's not always framed as the end of the world, but structurally it often functions like a secular apocalypse narrative. a world historical rupture, a necessary transition, a civilizational sacrifice, a story in which immense present suffering can be rationalized because the future is allegedly so vast, so important, so numerically overwhelming that current humans become morally secondary. That is not neutral. That is not just innovation. That is a metaphysics of disposability. And that is why this line matters so much. TESCREAL-style ideology does not always preach the end of the world. It often normalizes the sacrifice of the present world for an abstract future. That is a devastatingly but fair critique. And here's the sharper version. It is a secular eschatology dressed in the language of optimization. That is what makes it so dangerous, because it can sound intelligent, futuristic, morally serious, mathematically sophisticated, while quietly teaching people that ordinary human life is expendable, democracy is too slow, ethical limits are sentimental, crisis is an acceptable accelerator, and large-scale harm can be reframed as unfortunate but necessary for transition. That is apocalyptic logic in technocratic form. And because tech platforms mediate global consciousness now, this doesn't just stay in elite think pieces. It trickles outward. It becomes AI panic, civilizational fatalism, accelerization fetishism, mass helplessness, a digital prophecy disguised as systems analysis. And once again, fear becomes atmosphere, atmosphere becomes culture, culture becomes governance. Onto the controversial stuff. Okay. Zionism, Christian Zionism, and apocalyptic geopolitics. Now, here we need to address one of the most sensitive and most important parts of this entire conversation, and I want to begin with a clear distinction. This is not a critique of Jewish people. This is not a critique of Judaism. This is not a flattening of all forms of Zionism into one thing. This is where I can live that reality, because, as somebody that has studied all of these different, flavors of religion and the human experience of faith, I will go, okay, well, I'm not Jewish, I'm not ethically Jewish, but I am a cultural Jew in many ways, maybe not in this modern Hollywood, modern Jew or whatever, like where people are trying to get, anti-Semitic and, trying to do their little conspiracy theories. And yeah, there may be some logic in the corruption of Hollywood, but, I don't know if you can place that on one set of people. I think that might be a little myopic and, a little tribalistic. I think it's, again, systems, sociology. So, this is where it's fun, because the AI, I'm like, oh my God, the AI is probably, terrified of me just saying this word, but I'm actually one of those real people that actually understands the nuance. I may not believe in Zionism. I may, most people may say, oh, you're falling on that more the side of anti-Zionist, but as a philosopher able to engage with, thought experiments, I certainly can understand, the prospect of Zionism. I just don't flatten it into the specific political eschatology, holy moly, man. These freaking English words, man. Eschatological, the second you're hearing scat in your brain, your words just coming out with freaking verbal diarrhea. Well, how fun is that? So, back onto it, though. So, this is a critique of specific political and eschatological formations, especially where state power, settler colonial expansion, militarized exceptionalism, Christian Zionist prophecy, and the weaponization of sacred geography begin to reinforce each other. I would also say weaponization of perceived sacred geography. Like, this is where the AI needs to work on its nuance as well as me working on my nuance. We all need to work on our nuance, people. Work on your nuance. So, this is where they begin to reinforce each other, because that distinction matters. Because if we're not precise, we hand our argument to bad faith actors immediately. Here's the core issue. When land becomes prophecy, violence becomes easier to sanctify. And that is the heart of the problem. In certain forms of political Zionism, especially when fused with state security absolutism, and in Christian Zionism in particular, the Holy Land is no longer primarily treated as a living region of human beings, a plural historical landscape, a place of fragile coexistence, a site of ethical obligation. It becomes a state stage set for sacred history, a prophetic map, an eschatological storyboard. I just really need to work with that word. I may be a whole language reader, but with that word in particular, I think I need to work on the phonetics. Break it down piece by piece. Slow down. uh, so, so in when all those things get combined, it becomes a stage set for sacred history, a prophetic map, an eschatological storyboard, a symbolic trigger for world historical destiny. And once that happens, the human beings on the ground can disappear behind the script. This is why I would say Christian Zionism often treats the Middle East not as a living region of people, history, and culture, but as an eschatological theater. That line is powerful because it names the mechanism. When sacred geography is weaponized, escalation can be spiritualized, occupation can be moralized, mass suffering can be rationalized, war can be narrativized as destiny, restraint can be reframed as interference with prophecy. And this matters globally because these narratives do not stay confined to theology books. They shape lobbying, media framing, public consent, foreign policy discourse, symbolic alliances, militarized narratives of civilization, and the export of fear itself. So again, the key point is not religion is bad or Zionism is all one thing. That is a very lazy and frankly, it's sort of a hateful, reductionism. That point is that the point is that when political power and eschatological myth reinforce each other, fear becomes geopolitically scalable, and that is one of the most clearest examples of weaponized eschatology in the modern world. And that's where I know a lot of other people, intellectuals and systems thinkers, geopolitical pundits may be aware of that side of things, but they may not be aware of the TESCREAL side of things, the fact that we have this transhumanist secular eschatological framework of apocalyptic narratives, but it's different than the frickin' Christian nationalism. The Christian nationalism, like, they could pretty much only sell it to their base. The transhumanists with the TESCREAL, they could pretty much sell it to anybody. Because we live in the postmodern world where everybody's dropping religion, where everybody's becoming rationalist, it's that semantic framing that gets people hooked. It's dangerous. We need to be aware of that. So, and we need to be aware of how all these systems interlink, and that's what we're getting on to now. So what these three systems have in common. Let's pull these threads together. Christian nationalism, TESCREAL-style technocratic eschatology, apocalyptic geopolitics, especially where Christian Zionism and militarized state power converge. These are not identical systems. They have different histories, different vocabularies, different institutions, different elites, different self-understandings, but they overlap in structurally important ways. All three can convert uncertainty into authority, transform fear into legitimacy, narrate crisis as moral proof, subordinate living people to larger scripts, justify sacrifice in the present, flatten complexity into world historical inevitability, create identity through emergency, scale through media ecosystems, and normalize exceptional violence or exceptional control. That is the real pattern. They are all in very different ways engines of weaponized eschatology. There we go. I think that one threw me up because it wasn't the pluralized form or whatever. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that's what was going on there. So that is the phrase because they do not merely describe danger. They use danger to recruit, discipline, intensify, simplify, centralize, and govern. And that is why the culture of fear feels so ambient now, because it's no longer just an emotion. It is an infrastructure. See, this is very, very important. So, the globalization of fear and the metaphysical field. This is where I want to return to the deeper layer, because if you only analyze these systems politically, you still miss something important. These are not just institutions. These are meaning machines. But these are unethical meaning machines. These are meaning machines involved in necropolitics. We want to create meaning machines that heal our species, That's the work that John Vervaeke's trying to work on with the awakening of the meaning crisis. He recognizes this, meta-crisis of the postmodern world where we're all, devolving into entropic nihilism. It's all this fracturing, the pluralism that keeps our species sane and functional and healthy and intellectual. All these different, good keywords are getting lost. So these are not just institutions, they are meaning machines. They produce symbols, narratives, rituals, enemies, thresholds, sacred stakes, futures, atmospheres, and that means they don't just shape policy. They shape the metaphysical field. If that language feels too mystical for you, call it collective affect, or social entrainment, or mimetic atmosphere, symbolic ecology, emotional climate, civilizational mood, the social imaginary. The label matters less than the mechanism. When entire populations are repeatedly immersed in collapse narratives, final stage rhetoric, sacred emergency, technological inevitability, civilizational siege, exceptional threat, mythologized conflict, fear stops becoming episodic. It becomes ambient. And once fear becomes ambient, people self-censor. People radicalize. People become easier to govern. People become easier to recruit. People lose symbolic proportion. People mistake panic for clarity. People start feeling the field. They think they are merely observing. That is the tragic loop. The culture of fear becomes self-reinforcing, not because it is purely imaginatory, but because real crises are being metabolized through systems that need permanent emergency. That is why the global spread matters so much. This is not just America being weird. This is an exportable architecture, and it has been exported. Okay, what actual resistance looks like. So what do we do with all this? Because the answer is not denialism or denial, cynicism, nihilism, empty positivity, pretending there are no real crises, pretending no one is strategically exploiting fear. The answer is a three-part resistance. One, existential maturity. Do not let fear become your worldview. Learn how to live it without total certainty. Learn how to face instability without narrating it into a metaphysical finality. Learn how to grieve without being possessed by the collapse, because panic is not wisdom. 2. Systems literacy. Learn how apocalyptic narratives are produced. Ask who benefits, who's recruiting, what symbolic structure is being repeated, what emotional state is being induced, what forms of authority is being justified, and what lives are being rendered expendable. That is where real media literacy becomes ethical literacy. Ethical reconstruction. This is the deepest part. We do not defeat weaponized eschatology merely by debunking it. We defeat it by building life-serving institutions, grounded communities, pluralistic high culture, humane technologies, historical literacy, symbolic literacy, anti-sacrificial ethics, and what forms of solidarity that refuse to trade living people for abstract futures. That is where your broader framework is so powerful, because the alternative to doomerism is not naivety. It is nurture over sacrifice. In other words, again, my nurturism, And this is where it's so fun being a philosopher, because I say it's my nurturism and it's just the label that's sort of mine, but it's also not mine. There are real good parents out there that have, done amazing, education, growth, the spiritual, just done all their jobs, what they're supposed to do as parents. Those parents do exist. Yeah, they may not be as many as you want them to be, but some of them do exist, Just because we have this, these blinds of our negativity bias on doesn't mean we have to, say that isn't a reality, and that's where we need to start creating that reality. We need to, instead of this whole world of, child exploitation, let's create a whole world where we, nurture the child ethically, humanely, responsibly, this is... So, it says the alternative to doomerism is not naivety, is nurture over sacrifice. It is refusing the lie that the present must always be destroyed for some supposedly higher destiny. See, that's the freaking... That's like the crux of it, man. Like we're still in that whole freaking stage of our species, just destroy, and not enough of us have gotten into that, like, just, oh my god, man, we need to create, like, unless you've reached that, Hindu freaking Kali level, wisdom and understanding, the cyclical nature of the universe and all these different things. And, even that can be weaponized, So we need to be aware of all these different things. So, because yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Hindu nationalist would be you could be decide, okay, let's stop just using Vishnu, and let's start using Kali as well, because Kali can help us with our goals, because yeah. So yeah, everybody's, oh my god, we need some transdualism in this world. We need some systems thinking. We need some, uh, theological literacy. We need some philosophical literacy. We need to start studying these things. Come on, come on, come on. It's ridiculous. I'm just, I'm like literally amped up reading this because it's so good, and because YouTube is so full of slop, and it's so enshittified and so bloated that I can see it with the algorithm at play. I can see it. It's like, I don't take this personally. I know it's because YouTube sucks, and that's what down to the core truth of it. If I was doing these out, making these videos out in like 2011 or something, they would probably be blowing the hell up, But I was too late to the game. What can you do, So, on to the closing. Fear is not prophecy. There are real crises. There are real systems in decay. There are real reasons to be concerned, real reasons to prepare, real reasons to organize, real reasons to grieve. But there is a profound difference between responding to danger and building identity around dread. There is a difference between discernment and fear conditioning, between realism and collapse performance, between moral seriousness and weaponized eschatology. And when we fail to make those distinctions, then we become easier to manipulate by the algorithm, by the demagogue, by the technocrat, by the propagandist, by the sacred nationalist, by the pseudo prophet, by anyone who needs us afraid enough to stop thinking clearly. So no, the answer is not to ignore reality. Like I said, there's a real meta crisis out there. If you look into the meta crisis, the poly crisis, how all these things overlap, there is a real reason for this, ambiance of fear. But, you'll notice that, the people actually working on these problems, they're not really infected by that culture of fear. It's all the other people, that don't have, this framework, don't have this literacy, don't have this educational background, whatever, They're the people that are struggling right now, that are getting, fooled by these algorithms, that are being fooled by their leaders, So, no, we don't want to ignore reality. We don't want to push, toxic positivity, but we need to admit that these are real, overlapping crises that could potentially become an existential threat or wipe us out as a species, but we can't let that sink into us, and we can't let that fear, we have to work on the existential maturity. If you work on the existential maturity and you're already working from these frameworks and stuff, it doesn't hit you the same way, and it still can affect you. It certainly does. It still affects me, but I'd say instead of it hitting me at like a good 60 to 90%, reaction, I have like a 10% reaction, it's like if I focus on the 10%, I can blow that 10% up at 100%, give myself a goddamn panic attack if I wanted, just, focusing on the TESCREAL and all this stuff. But no, I'm going to compartmentalize it in a healthy way, recognize it's only 10%, don't blow that 10% up into 100, separate the logic from the emotion. Yeah. So, the answer is not to ignore reality. The answer is to refuse systems that turn reality into permanent emergency, to refuse the ideologies that feed on existential insecurity, to refuse the narratives that sanctify sacrifice, to refuse the lie that fear itself is a wisdom, because panic is not prophecy. Doomerism is not discernment. And if we want a future worth inhabiting, we need more than criticism. We need existential courage, systems literacy, symbolic proportion, historical humility, ethical reconstruction, and cultures of meaning strong enough to resist the seduction of collapse. Enough of the apocalyptic doomerism, not because nothing is wrong, but because too much depends on our ability to see clearly without becoming servants of fear. If this resonated, feel free to comment, where do you think the line is between healthy concern and weaponized fear? You know, if you're tired of being of fear being marketed as wisdom, hit like. You know, share this, comment, talk about it. You know, like I'm not the kind of person that does that. I'm saying this because the AI is saying it. If I was, I wouldn't be saying that myself. I'm not into the digital cargo cult. I'm not into the personality cult. I'm not into the views, the likes, the like. I'm not into all that. It's all, I'm the one autistic trans person that doesn't do all the VTubing, all the social media. Like I'm living in my own humble, solitary reality until the culture can get a little healthier, or until I can find the right groups of healthy people, because this is a mess. I've been seeing it, just the past 9 months, as a philosopher, engaging with the philosophy channels on YouTube. You just look up philosophy, StreamYard, go click the live under the YouTube search, see how many are going at one time. It's often just 2 or 3, and it's often just 2 or 3 channels, and they're in social bubbles and doing their own thing. It's just it's not just the social bubbles. That would be one thing. I could handle just the social bubbles, but they're getting sucked into the digital cargo cult. They're trying to increase escalation. Let's do bad faith debating, to turn this into the Jerry Springer show and get maximum clicks and views. And I don't engage with that. I don't engage with that. I don't engage with, all these massive amounts of, AI thumbnails, or thumbnails that look like they were done through graphic editing. That's where I stopped doing all that on mine. I'm just leave it with the auto thumbnails of my video of me doing whatever the hell I'm doing right now. So yeah, we need to get more authentic online, people. We need to get more authentic, more sincerity and more authenticity online. Enough of the the profilicity and the just all that fake shit, man. Like the internet is literally turned into reality television, and I don't watch reality television, and that's why I don't engage with the internet like I once did. It's pretty much just YouTube, freaking large language models, and Wikipedia. That's pretty much it. Oh, besides, engaging with just basic streaming devices of, popping on Netflix or whatever. But besides that, I don't really engage with the World Wide Web anymore. I engage with the internet, but World Wide Web? No, the World Wide Web is dead. It's dead internet theory. It's blatantly up in your face. Just, yeah. So, so yeah, I don't know. I think that's about it for it now. But anyway, I just wanted to share that because it's some things I've been noticing big time. Big time. And yeah, there's no fixing that instantly, but awareness is the first step, So, anyway, this has been Sage DeForest over at Saged and Confused. Peace and victory. Signing out.